Good morning. Welcome to World Review from the Chicago Council on Global Affairs. I'm Ivo Daalder, president of the Chicago Council, and I'm looking forward to having another great conversation on the week's world news. With us today is Susan Glasser, staff writer and columnist for The New Yorker, and author of the weekly Not to Be Missed Letter from Trump's Washington column. Susan, great to have you here.
Thank you so much, Ivo.
Also with us is Matthew Kaminski, editor-in-chief of POLITICO. Matt, great to have you.
Great to be here, Ivo.
And Peter Spiegel, U.S. managing editor of the Financial Times. Peter, welcome.
Thank you for having me, Ivo.
A lot of things to discuss this week. Let's start with the big story that is affecting most people in Europe, in Asia, here, even in the United States. Matt, and that's the question of when are we going to move to our new normal, reopening the economy, and how, and what are we learning from each other? Some places, of course, never shut down, places like South Korea and Hong Kong and Taiwan. Others are still in lockdown and will remain so for some time. But in Europe, we are seeing slowly but surely shops opening, schools reopening, and people getting out of their houses and starting to get on with business. How is it emerging in Europe, and what can we learn from what's happening there, Matt, for the United States?
Well, you know, Ivo, you did mention South Korea and Taiwan, and they did in fact shut down. And I think if we're going to maybe find some sliver of a silver lining to this pretty gigantic cloud where we're all flying through right now, is that the place where this all started in Asia, they are several weeks ahead of us, and there's probably more than several weeks ahead of us in starting to get back to some semblance of normal. You know, Vietnam has had no positive tests for 2 weeks. Taiwan had barely any cases. And China is probably the closest that we see out there to coming back to any kind of, say, economic activity at any scale that would be give us some optimism. That said, Asia was also the place that was best prepared for this. They've gone through pandemics before. They imposed quarantines very early. They had airport checks very early. They did temperature checks. They had an infrastructure in place for testing. And that is the more actually concerning story from Asia, that the places where, if you go, let's say, sort of travel westward, in Europe, Germany, they're very proud of themselves of this. They are probably the best place because they had a great testing infrastructure and a great sort of hospital system. But places like France and Britain are barely getting their arms around the health problem, and then you have the economic problem, which in Spain and Italy, I mean, we just don't know the depth of how far we're going to fall. You know, summer is off the table. I think for the first time in European history, they're going to miss German tourists. Angela Merkel, I think this week, told Germans that not to plan their trip down to Mallorca, and that's actually very bad news for a lot of Europe. And then we come to the U.S., where obviously this week you have Georgia and South Carolina are kind of starting to reopen. I think there's probably a case for parts of the U.S., and this is where this has to be done not even just by state, but is going to have to be done even by city, that you're going to have to relax things. But, you know, a place like New York, it doesn't seem anywhere near close to even thinking about restarting normal life.
Peter, I noticed that one of the interesting things when you look at Europe in particular is the disjunction between not only how different countries reacted, with Sweden actually really never closing down, using social distancing or physical distancing as a warning that people should be able to do that, but that's about it. And then in Eastern Europe, very early action, and in fact, very few deaths. I think I read in your paper just this morning that in all of Eastern Europe, the numbers of deaths are less than they are in a country like the UK or Italy or Spain by day. And that gives you some hope that there is a way to control this disease.
It does, but again, you know, the lack of understanding, not only on a policy side, but frankly from a medicine and health side, has complicated the narrative here, because sometimes we just don't know actually why some countries have seen more successes than others. The Germany case, and particularly as Matt mentioned, is an outlier. It's a neighboring country to France and Italy, but it's had a lower death rate. Has it been because, as Matt pointed out, better testing regime, a better health system, or has it been even just the way that doctors have treated patients? The Germans are less likely to use intubation, to use some of these much heralded ventilators, and as a result, some of the medical research says that's why the patients haven't died as much. So I guess I have guided our reporters on this and said, look, let's not make too many conclusions based on sort of anecdotal or even more than anecdotal evidence country to country, because I think we just don't understand right now exactly why certain countries are able to reopen, with more robustness than other countries. And as you said, that's the same thing that's going to happen here eventually. I mean, sometimes here in New York, we feel like we'll be the last ones still locked in our houses as Texans, and my family's from Arizona. They're all out and about. We may be still stuck in here. And I think it's one of those things that we don't have the answers. And I think we should be humble to the fact that we don't have those answers yet.
Susan, I think one place where, in fact, the lockdown was let go and now it's back on is Singapore, a country that in Asia that had worked very rapidly to try to control what was happening, and now we see a pretty big explosion, admittedly in a particularly confined community where migrants work, but it does give this sense that we're not in. This is not an open and shut case that we shut, we open, and it's all over. We may be going through waves, and and we'll see what happens in the United States as different states open at different points in time, how that will affect us.
Well, that's right. To Peter's point about how much is still unknown just about the virus itself and what works and what doesn't, the bottom line is that until we have an effective antiviral treatment and or a vaccine, neither of which are in any immediate prospects of magically appearing, that we're going to see, I think, lots of new stories that don't fit this very simplistic and clearly inaccurate model that some people, including our president, were using, of this sort of light switch approach that we're just going to turn it back on. Essentially, we're talking on May 1st, which was the end of this 30 days in the United States that Trump couldn't even last the 30 days on. But, someone asked me, I think, a really good question today, which is, well, what was the point of that? Why is there any difference between opening up now and later? What have we accomplished? And, if you look at what a lot of the scientific experts, as opposed to economists or as opposed to politicians in either party, are saying, it's pretty clear the goal was to achieve something like a more widespread testing regime in the United States, or to have a plan to use that time to accomplish something that would better enable us not to simply open up and go through the cycle all over again, to extend the time frame of new infections so that our hospitals wouldn't be overburdened. Well, if you look at some of the numbers I was just looking at before this conversation, the number of amount of testing per day in the United States in the beginning of April was like 140,000, 150,000, averaging. By the end of April, it was only in the 220,000 or so. Not a radical enough increase. So that we didn't use that month to accomplish the testing. I'm here in Washington, D.C., where there have amazingly enough been more deaths than in the entire country of Greece. Okay. And it doesn't get the attention that New York City does because it's not as much of an acute epicenter. But there are places like Washington all over the United States right now. And the U.S. Senate is coming back into session next week. And there are not enough tests at the U.S. Capitol to even test all 100 U.S. senators, even though I think just about a majority of them are what you would call high risk population. So here in the United States, the story is not one of, gee, let's just open it up. Sadly, that's a kind of delusional assessment, I think, of where we actually are on May 1st.
Thanks, Susan. I want to remind our listeners that they can join us by going to their web browser and typing in ccga.live. And you can either vote for a question that's already been asked or ask your own question, and we'll get to it in the course of the conversation. Again, with us, Peter Spiegel from the Financial Times, Susan Glasser of the New Yorker, and Matt Kaminski of Politico. Susan, let me stay with you for a minute and go to the one of the places we haven't talked about, but you know a lot about, Russia. If there's a country that is at the start of the rise in the Northern Hemisphere, it seems to be Russia. Things are getting worse. The Prime Minister just announced that he tested positive, and it seems to be affecting the macho image of Vladimir Putin, who likes to write tigers and all kinds of other things in order to demonstrate how strong he is. But in this case, a virus seems to be affecting his capacity to govern.
Yeah, I think it's really fascinating. So, next week will be actually the 20th anniversary of Putin being in power, of his inauguration. He was supposed to be celebrating that in a triumphal way by hosting a 75th anniversary of victory in Europe parade. There was even talk at one point that Donald Trump might go to that. Instead, Putin had to bow to the inevitable and cancel the parade. On April 22nd, he was supposed to hold a national referendum that would enable him to blow past the Constitution, the Russian Constitution's term limits, and enable him to stay in power well into the 2030s. And that's already been approved, those constitutional amendments, by the Russian Duma. But now that referendum to extend his tenure in power had to be canceled because of this. His approval ratings are sliding, as you said, for a politician whose brand is all-powerful man of action. Sitting at home doing Zoom calls from the dacha is not exactly, on brand for him. And in fact, actually, Putin had an interesting, almost Trumpian approach to the virus early on, both a kind of being denialist and even triumphalist, like it's not coming here. In February and March, he would have thought he had single-handedly managed to avoid the rest of the world's fate. And then once it did come to Russia, trying to off-put decision-making responsibility, basically forcing governors and local officials to take the heat for individual decisions after 2 decades of telling the Russian people essentially that he was all-powerful and had their best interests at heart. So I think it's really undermined, kind of brand Putin.
So it's really interesting, Ivo. I wanted to sort of add on this point is it hasn't been a good crisis for the macho men of sort of global politics. You have obviously Putin, Bolsonaro down in Brazil. This does not play to Trump's strengths nor to his style. Boris Johnson was out there kind of also not fully in the denial camp, but more in the, this is all past. Let's not go overboard. And there's kind of an interesting dynamic, this sort of contrast between their political styles. And on the other side, some of the medical experts, not just Tony Fauci in the U.S., but I think they're very prominent. There's a prominent woman in Britain and in Canada who sort of lead the more sort of medical risk response to this, and obviously Angela Merkel, who has a very different political style and the way that she has handled this, arguably more capably.
I'd throw Xi Jinping in there as well, obviously. I mean, much of the Chinese response has been propaganda as opposed to, well, I wouldn't say much of, but there has obviously been a strong propaganda element of the Chinese response for this very reason, that once again, the almighty Xi Jinping, who's supposed to be all-knowing and all-seeing, clearly had failed in Wuhan, and now not only domestic propaganda is focused on rehabilitating his image, but the international propaganda as well. So I think that's exactly right. This is not just a Putin thing. It's all the autocrats who thought they're relying frequently on cult of personality have been undermined by their inability to manage this like anyone else can. Although
I would just inject a cautionary note, which is to say that these are the kind of people who are more adept at playing a long game than American-style politicians with their, sort of Twitter trigger fingers and short news cycles, and that, in fact, we may be looking on this in the rearview mirror in a very different way as a moment of opportunity for authoritarian leaders or those who would be to seize more power. And we've already seen that in Hungary and in Poland. I think that, it's the kind of thing that I'm trying to be very alert to, because I believe that the irresistible temptation to impose structural long-term changes under the name of emergency powers is something that is almost irresistible to an authoritarian or someone who wants to be.
I think that's a wise word, a word of caution. I'd add to the leadership issue, of course, that the more emphatic leaders and scientifically driven leaders, and I would not only include Angela Merkel, but also the Prime Minister of New Zealand, the Prime Minister of Denmark, are the kinds of people who are coming out of this crisis as people who said this is something we need to solve collectively, and there seems to be less worried about their political standing in the world, which in some ways has affected certain other leaders. Talking about leaders who've not really come out of this well, Peter, in Iran, of course, a huge major impact of this crisis on what's happening in Iran, with many of the top leaders themselves being affected and some falling to it. This is the week that the United States has decided to put the screws back onto Iran. We saw the president talking about shooting down gunboats. Not sure how you shoot down gunboats if they're in the water, but that's another issue. And of course, the United States moving in the UN Security Council to see if they can reimpose sanctions on Iran. What's going on?
Well, I mean, look, I think it is a sign that the hawks of the administration have used this opportunity to reassert themselves. We've seen it, frankly, on China as well, with Peter Navarro in particular, clearly whispering in Trump's ear to change the narrative that this is a Wuhan virus that is led by the Chinese. And now suddenly we have Iran on the front burner. Now, look, I think there is, to step back, there are things that, and in talking particularly to our colleagues who are covering this from Europe, there are elements of this that the European members of the nuclear deal are not objecting to. Now, one of the things that Pompeo in particular is very worried about is the lifting of arms embargo on Iran that falls in October. I think what you would see is that there are European powers and American allies who are sensitive to the fact that perhaps now is not the best time to be resuming small arms and shipments to Iran. But as per always with the Trump administration, they seem to be very ham-handed at the way they approach diplomacy on this, concocting some sort of legal argument that they are still participants in the JCPOA because of the UN Security Council, the resolution that oversees this. The overriding thing that I think which you were seeing is that there has been a call by the WHO and others to ease some of the sanctions because, Ivo, as you said, Iran was an early and very hard hit country, and a lot of the sanctions that were on Iran had hampered their ability to respond medically. And as you said, we started seeing almost the entire leadership be infected in the early days of the outbreak. So I don't want to conflate the two things. I don't think the Trump administration is necessarily, although you never know with them, necessarily arguing that we should continue imposing sanctions on humanitarian issues. Even the president himself has said if the Iranians want it, we can help out. Their maneuver right now is very tightly focused on an arms embargo. But yet again, because the diplomacy seems to be so ham-handed, they've messed up the messaging on this, they've angered the allies, and you're suddenly getting a pushback from the Europeans on this, where actually there probably is much agreement on the issue itself on resuming arms shipments into Iran. And proliferation.
I think, Susan, one of the challenges, of course, is we had a global coalition that included the Europeans, the Russians, and the Chinese, that on the issue of Iran has been broken. And the Russians, in particular, are now interested in making sure that they are on the good side of almost everybody, including the Iranians, and they're very interested in selling arms to Iran, which I think is part of the problem that is driving this. How does the administration think they're going to solve this issue?
I don't think they think they're going to solve this issue. A couple of thoughts. One, I have been trying to sort of watch what we're hearing American foreign policy-wise as the crisis plays out, largely in its initial stages here, as both one around domestic politics, public health, and the U.S. economy itself. And I think what we're seeing is more along the lines of a default setting. Essentially, you see the Secretary of State, Mike Pompeo, being extraordinarily low visibility. That's one thing that's really, struck me. This is probably the biggest kind of hinge moment global crisis, not, certainly since 2008, but really there's only been a few of any of our adult lifetimes comparable to this in terms of a global impact. 1989 to 1991, of course, the end of the Cold War period, and perhaps 9/11 and the resulting shakeup in the world order, and then the Great Recession and yet the United States has really not been leading. Mike Pompeo, his last trip was more than a month ago, a failed effort to work on the peace deal in Afghanistan. Since then, he's been giving interviews to right-wing talk radio hosts and organizing flights of Americans back from other countries, and that's it. There's been no leadership. What you have heard instead is kind of each week a different foreign policy theme. So you mentioned this week was Iran, but Trump mentioned that at the beginning of the week. Then we haven't heard another word out of him since then. So it was like somebody got that talking point, onto his note card that day. But I don't think that it represents a sustained policy focus. Same thing. We've heard him talk about Venezuela at various points. Those are the default policy settings of an optics-driven foreign policy team under Donald Trump. I don't actually put it along the lines of a serious effort. I do think Trump tried a few weeks ago to make a serious effort and failed, which is why we don't hear much about it, to address a major international shock that we haven't talked about yet, which is the precipitous collapse in oil and gas prices, which affects, of course, not only the U.S. economy, but Russia, whom we're talking about, Iran, and Saudi Arabia. Trump tried to get in the middle, tried to get Russia and Saudi Arabia working together. Even when they have been talking, it's basically failed completely to do anything about a collapse that really is driven by the shutdown in the world economy. And so I see that as a major, major factor driving a lot of this geopolitics going forward that doesn't have anything to do with the kind of BS that you hear on Fox News.
I think an interesting point here too, Ivo, is that about, the geopolitical plates are shifting and quite dramatically, yet we have no idea how it is going to kind of settle out. It's sort of too early to say. There's, I think, both around Iran and around China, I think to Susan's point earlier, Corona could end up strengthening these authoritarian regimes. You can also imagine a scenario where this becomes the Chinese Communist Party's Chernobyl, the sort of the kind of delegitimizing event that is going to whittle away at domestic support and also is clearly harming China's relationships with the rest of the world. Similarly, in Iran, it is the dream of the neoconservatives to have regime change in Iran, but for a moment, it looked like the coronavirus would bring about regime change just by eliminating most of the regime. That hasn't happened, but you just don't know what's going to go longer term. I think similarly for the U.S., this hasn't been the proudest moment in American global leadership. Yet I also wouldn't sort of say that longer term, it's not impossible to imagine that someone does need to lead the response. That America does remain the wealthiest and the strongest power. And if we do refocus back on, how do we bring up our manufacturing base? How do we sort of reassert global leadership through the UN, through other bodies? Then you could say, well, this is kind of the renewal of the vows that had been looking pretty sort of weak. Those post-Cold War II vows between Europe and the U.S.
That would involve regime change, however, Matt.
Domestically, yes.
The way that scenario involves our current political situation.
But to Matt's point, though, what is as someone, I think all four of us have spent most of our careers following these kind of, interplay of great power politics. What is amazing about this, much like the outbreak itself, is we actually don't have an answer. We just seem to have gotten in an argument about whether this outbreak could help or hurt authoritarian regimes. And frankly, we all have our opinions, but no one really knows this. And similarly for the more democratic regimes. I mean, I think what is both troubling and fascinating about the current environment is actually we don't know. And in 6 months, it could be completely different. And that, again, as a status quo power in the U.S., one that has been advantaged by the last 60 years, it's a rather frightening prospect that the status quo is under threat. And I think that only is more of a danger to us than an opportunity, just to slightly disagree with Matt on that one, because I do think that it is the benefit to the West if the prevailing post-war order continues, and it probably won't, but we just don't know what it's going to look like afterwards.
I agree with you, Peter. I would just say that the Europeans don't have any other options than the U.S., and at the end of the day, they always know that.
Yeah, and that's probably true for a whole bunch of our friends in East Asia as well. Speaking of East Asia, Matt, the other crisis that just emerged or seemingly emerged, at least in the newspapers, it may not actually be a real crisis in reality, is this question of what's happening in North Korea. And again, the president mentioned that he knew what was going on with Kim Jong-un, but he couldn't say and let us know. The South Koreans have made clear that they don't think anything is happening. To Susan's point, the United States, other than a statement here or there, has not been, I think, as active as one would think in a crisis that could affect 28,000 American soldiers that are living in South Korea and many thousands more of Americans, both in Korea and in Japan and other places. What's going on?
I mean, that's the other great, who the hell knows what's going on besides what's going to happen with Corona. Is Kim Jong-un alive? Or is he on a secret getaway in a Pacific island, or is he recovering from ankle surgery? And look, this is obviously, it's called the Hermit Kingdom for a reason. We don't really have any great insight. I think the South Koreans probably have the best insights, but they also wouldn't necessarily kind of make clear everything they know. This is clearly a challenge for the region itself. I mean, any prospect of instability in North Korea terrifies everyone. It terrifies Beijing because they like that sort of status quo situation, however weird that family has been, and a collapse there would send refugees over. It would sort of really destabilize that region. I think similarly, South Korea is not certainly wishing for the end of the Kim regime. It's certainly not in a kind of in this sort of way. Partly because the collapse would also, send refugees over the border. This is a nuclear power. What happens to those nukes? I think Susan and I were probably writing about this in the early 90s. What happened to the Russian nukes and the Ukrainian nukes? This would be kind of a similar sort of nightmare scenario. And also, you don't know what would happen after. Apparently, his sister is said to be the one that might be next in line, and she may even be nastier than this guy. So I guess it is obviously a challenge for the Trump approach to diplomacy, which is focused around deal making and personalities, and having kind of invested so much in a relationship with one man, that obviously puts the U.S. on a back foot with North Korea. I think people in the State Department are a little bit frustrated that they don't have other avenues into this very difficult relationship. But he may come out, meaning Kim Jong-un may come out on the stage tomorrow and kind of laugh at us for even having this conversation. So.
I mean, Peter, the other sort of noteworthy part in as we all contemplate what's happening in the crisis is that since at least the Bush administration, we've worked with the Chinese very closely to try to manage this crisis in the six-party talks and throughout the Obama administration, and trying to get some serious sanctions on the Chinese. We don't seem to be talking to the Chinese about this at the moment, or maybe we are, but it's not very public.
No, but I must say, from the Chinese perspective, I must give them some credit in the extent to which they've been able, or at least have tried to compartmentalize things with the Trump administration. They've tried to compartmentalize, again, the great geostrategic issues from the trade war, so that they can work on multiple channels. So the current environment has hampered that. It's hampered communication. It's hampered the ability to sort of reach out. But I think in the past, at least, what we have been able to see is that the Chinese, Xi Jinping in particular, but the Chinese regime more in general, has tried to keep the various different lanes going at multiple speeds. Do not let Trump's verbosity and his anger and his rhetoric on the trade issue to infect other issues where there may be common ground, like North Korea. Given that what Trump is doing now is much more existential to Xi. I mean, if Trump is literally, for instance, accusing the Chinese of inventing coronavirus in a lab in Wuhan and putting it on the world, well, that starts to get to sort of regime legitimacy issues, which I think you will see the Chinese then begin to close off many of those channels that they had tried to keep open in the past. So I think that's the risk there, because it seems like going into the election cycle, the Trump strategy is increasingly trying to portray Biden as some sort of weak on China guy, and that they want to develop this narrative that not my fault this happened. It was these scientists in Wuhan, these Chinese scientists, it's a Chinese flu. And I think that is the nervousness when it comes back to North Korea, is that channel that may have been open in the past because the Chinese have tried to segment it, may be closing off because they see a real existential threat from the rhetoric coming out of the White House.
Susan, pick that up if you can, particularly this thing that emerged this week, where clearly there's a push from the White House now, not only to blame the Chinese, which has been there for a long time, but talking about compensation and financial punishment, as well as the push reported in papers in the last few days on trying to get the intelligence community to confirm that this virus may have come not from a natural evolution, but through a lab where it may have leaked out. It, presumably still a natural virus, because it's not, I think scientists have proven this is not an engineered virus, but it came out of a lab rather than out of a wet market or whatever else we thought. It seems to be ratcheting up in the last week. And how do we look at that? What does that all mean?
Yeah, no, thank you. I think Peter's right to spotlight this, because clearly you're going to hear more and more about this, because this is the play that the Trump political team has decided upon. And he's also facing, I would say, a pretty organized and active pressure group of influential Republicans outside of his administration who already, you had seen the gears shift in the foreign policy machine to focus more and more on China. And in fact, many of the officials inside the administration and out who were the most vocal early on about the need to prepare for the pandemic, this essentially came out of the China hawk camp inside the Republican Party, who were focused on it as a kind of a China story and an anti-China story. So that infrastructure already existed. And then you combine that with Trump's increasing panic over his political situation, and I think you have, kind of ignition now. Remember that Trump himself, this is an area where, kind of like with Russia policy, you could say that there was a Trump administration policy toward China, especially on the national security side. And then you could say there was a Trump policy toward China. And those were not always the same things. And in fact, Trump often listened to his economic advisors and to his own gut instinct, which said that, I care more about having a robust economy and not blowing that up by being too tough with the Chinese. He felt that he was in the middle of negotiating a trade deal with China, that at the beginning stages of the lockdown, he was very wary of doing anything to disturb that. He started calling it the China virus. And then he had a phone call with Xi Jinping a few weeks back, who clearly registered objection to it, and Trump stopped using it. And he even admitted at one of his press briefings that he did so at Xi's behest, that the Chinese didn't like it, so fine, I won't use it, he said. And so why do you now see this coming back up as the singular focus of the political conversation coming out of Trump's campaign? The reason is that I think it's about the blame game and looking to deflect it as opposed to a serious policy consideration. For example, one of the things that we're seeing this week is hearing very kind of blustery talk from Republicans. Well, we're going to look at even stripping China of sovereign immunity to force them to pay damages as a result of this havoc they've unleashed on the world. Now, that strikes me as not a serious legal threat. And, can you imagine if the United States was stripped of sovereign immunity for its actions in the Middle East over the last decade? I mean, come on. This is not the way that the international system is structured to work. So again, I think it's significant in the political bluster department, and we'll see how much Americans buy it. Right now, interestingly, the polls show that Americans are actually kind of bipartisan about this. Both Democrats and Republicans do believe that China, is significantly at fault for covering up information about the virus early on. And yet, they are also capable of believing that Donald Trump bungled the initial response to the crisis here. And that strikes me as, kind of a fairly realistic assessment, at least at the moment, based on what we know right now. They both have responsibility and blame, and it's not an either or equation.
Matt, let's stick on the foreign policy consequences of a debate like this. Because as Peter said, the Chinese may have been able to compartmentalize their dealings with the Trump administration. If the Trump administration is now no longer compartmentalizing China in its policy, although as Susan said, there was a difference between the president and the administration on this. What incentive is there for the Chinese to cooperate with us as we need to on scientific discovery with regard to the virus or a whole bunch of other things? Or let alone, what are we telling the rest of the world to do when they're faced with this competition between the United States and China, when much of the world needs both?
Well, I think I think Susan made a really good point that there is a sort of policy and there is the politics, and in this administration, those two things have coexisted, and oftentimes without much strain between the two. And I think so Donald Trump, it's really, his messaging is a kind of yo-yoing messaging. On the one hand, we're striking the best deal ever with the Chinese, and they're doing a great job on Corona. And when the moment feels right, he will push the sort of China narrative because that really works so well with his base. I do suspect the Chinese are quite pragmatic in their approach to this, and also they understand this very well themselves. President Xi knows that. Let's say before Corona, Donald Trump could not afford for the market to crash because the strong economy was his best ticket to re-election. And a really proper trade war was the greatest threat to the sort of market war. I think similarly now, they also understand that they have a mutual interest in sort of bringing back the supply chains, in reviving trade, and in kind of getting things back on track. I think similarly, President Xi, his legitimacy is based on the Chinese economic miracle. I think he's brought much sort of louder nationalist notes into his domestic messaging, but ultimately that party is its hold on power now is fully dependent on the capitalist miracle that is modern China, and they understand how dependent they are on the rest of the world. This pandemic, unlike previous ones. Party may have been a virus, but it also spread so quickly because China is so much more a part of this world than it ever was. If you saw those incredible sort of maps of the planes coming out of Wuhan around the Chinese New Year, direct flights to Milan, to Seattle, to San Francisco, this virus spread because China is so interwoven in the global economy. So I think they have no choice, and they also realize that there is actually common policy ground with this president, and I think they might even turn a deaf ear to the coming campaign. And the coming campaign, frankly, China will be one of the two or three top issues here in the U.S.
Ivo, I just agree with Matt on this, because I just in historical context, this is not going to be the first election where China bashing becomes a theme, right? This goes back to the Clinton era. It's been a theme every 4 years, and what we always hear from the Chinese, and when we sort of push them on this, is we're used to this. It happens every 4 years, and we'll go back to normality afterwards. Now, of course, that didn't happen necessarily with Trump, but I just want to flag that up. This will not be new to the Chinese, and Matt's right on that. The other point, though, Ivo, on your question about this need to cooperate with the Chinese on medical issues and health issues, which could be complicated by a sort of very aggressive U.S. posturing on this one. I would just say we've done some reporting on the fact that despite the fact there has been government-to-government tensions, we've seen the civil society to really actually reach out with each other. You have sort of medical centers in the U.S. reaching out to the Chinese Centers for Disease Control. So I think I am less worried about that, because I think in the professional technocratic levels, you are going to see medical experts cooperate. So I'm less worried about the politics infecting that that area. So much like Matt, I think it's to me a much more pragmatic response, and I'm not less worried about how that's going to impact the response to the outbreak.
I like the optimism where this goes. I hope we can all share it. I'm going to ask one of the questions asked. What's that?
It's a very cheery panel.
We're trying. It's Friday.
A question that came over on the internet that I just want to ask you guys, which is, and Susan touched a little bit on this. It relates to the U.S.-Saudi relationship and whether the big breakup we now have in the oil markets is going to fundamentally, finally, in the end, affect the nature of the relationship between the United States and Saudi Arabia, which has been so infused with oil for so long. Any views on this, Susan?
I mean, look, again, the number of unknowns we're dealing with here is almost overwhelming in terms of any kind of future forecasting. What I would say is that Donald Trump has really doubled down on that relationship in a striking way, actually, over the last few years. You would have thought that the consequence of American energy independence might have been leading any American president, Democrat or Republican, in the direction of some distancing from the Saudis as we became more independent and more able to kind of chart our own destiny on the energy markets. And yet, for now, the administration took almost the exact opposite path, which was to really reinforce it and, of course, to be there in particular at a moment of acute crisis for the Saudis when Mohammed bin Salman chose to order, apparently, the murder of an American resident dissident journalist. And, essentially you had the administration and the president and the Secretary of State take the side of the Saudis. That's the kind of stuff that people don't forget, right? That builds, I think, long-term loyalty. So I do not foresee if this current administration continues for another 4 years, as is possible still after the U.S. election, I would not see any striking move away from that partnership. I do believe, for a variety of reasons, that a Democratic administration would take a very different approach to foreign policy in the Gulf and specifically toward the Saudis. So I think it's actually probably as dependent on the U.S. election as it is on the pandemic.
Ivo, if I could jump in here as the Financial Times guy to look at it briefly from the corporate point of view, because what is interesting to me actually is Texas politics on this, because you have two elements of the energy industry that's now talking into each side of Trump's ear. You first have the shale industry, right? This is, over the last 5-10 years, one of the biggest revolutions in the American economy has been we've become a domestic supplier. We have figured out how to frack. We've developed our own domestic shale industry, largely in the Permian Basin in Texas. And you have a lot of those people who are very close to Trump. They've been big Trump donors, big Trump friends, and they're whispering in his ear saying, you need to go after the Saudis. We need sanctions. We need to ban Saudi oil coming into Houston to be refined. And we need to drive up the prices because right now, shale in Texas is losing money. They're shutting wells. They're collapsing. Their debts are coming due. They're going bankrupt. And in the other year, you have big oil. You have ExxonMobil, you have Chevron, you have the big companies that do a lot of business with Saudi who are saying, no, we don't want this. And for the time being, Trump has, much to frankly some of our surprise, sided with big oil. They have decided we do not want to go with the Saudis. There's too much big American economic interest in our big American companies invested in Saudi, and has basically left the shale guys out to dry. And I think this is going to have an impact on Texas politics. Right? Texas, we never thought was going to be a purple state, but is increasingly becoming, Beto O'Rourke and some of the other dynamics happening in Texas. The energy sector in Texas is being hit hard, and these shale guys are going under. And we've been watching very closely how this impacts the general election in November. Because Texas is going to be very, very hard hit economically because of this fallout.
Matt, give you about 30 seconds to add your, in 30 seconds, to the view not only of Texas politics, but where do you think the Saudi relationship is going with the United States? Will it stay as it has been since 1943, a strong relationship, or do you think we're in a new era?
Well, inshallah, no. I think that maybe that also would be one of the other positive geopolitical aspects of this. If you add it to the list of the kind of known unknowns, so the known unknown here geopolitically is will Saudi Arabia play the outsized role that it does in both in our security strategy, as well as our sort of, our approach to that part of the world. I think it's a funny place. I personally tend to cheer on low oil prices, not just because you pay less at the pump, but because it is very bad for Russia, Venezuela, Iran, and Saudi Arabia. But I think we've come to a point where this is far too low, and it has kind of catastrophic consequences for the shale, for our own domestic oil industry, and it's indicative of the kind of, just to end on a sour note here, on an unprecedented economic collapse in the world that we just don't know how we're going to come out of it. So I guess having sort of Saudi Arabia knocked down a few notches, but also having civilization not ended would be maybe the ideal outcome we would want to see out of this.
We'll leave it there for the for this week. Matt Kaminski, Peter Spiegel, Susan Glasser, thanks all for joining us, and thank you for tuning into World Review. We'll be back next Friday. Thank you.
Thank you.